So, in our lockdown series, we've been looking at biblical characters whose strong faith is such a powerful example and inspiration to us. And today's faith hero is going to be Joseph. I'm sure Joseph is nearly everyone's favourite biblical character. I can remember going to watch my sister in the Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat show back in the 80s. I looked that show up and was reminded that Jason Donovan and Donny Osmond and Philip Schofield all played Joseph on stage in the 1990s. So it's a very well-known, famous story, but you know what? It's so much more than just a good story. Joseph went on quite the journey, didn't he? And that journey was full of faith lessons. You know, and within that, there's so much that we can learn of kingdom principle. So let's start with a quick resume of Joseph's life and story. If you remember, he was the 11th of Jacob's 12 sons, born to 4 different wives. As a teenager, he worked mostly as a shepherd, tending his father's sheep. But as we remember, he was always his father's favourite, largely because he was born to Rachel, who was the wife that Jacob really loved. And of course, because he was his father's favourite, he was given this coat, this amazing coat, this technicolored coat of many colours, as a sign of how special he was. And you can imagine how well that went down amongst his brothers. Then, just to make matters worse, Joseph had 2 dreams. In the first dream, his brothers, represented by bundles of grain, all bowed down to his bundle of grain. And then in the second dream, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were seen bowing down to Joseph. I think the symbolism here was pretty obvious, and suffice it to say that didn't go down very well in his family. And to cut a long story short, he soon found himself at the bottom of a dry well. And in fact, he was sold to Midianite slave traders for 20 pieces of silver, and he was taken to the Egyptian slave market. You know, all this happened while he was just 17 years old, if you can imagine. So in that slave market, as we remember, he was bought by a man called Potiphar, who, as it happened, was the captain of Pharaoh's palace guard, very powerful, significant man. And while he was working for Potiphar, he just started to manifest the characteristics, the qualities of those dreams. And in time, he was promoted actually to run Potiphar's whole household. All was going well until there was an incident with Potiphar's rather flirtatious and lustful wife. And unjustly, Joseph found himself thrown into prison. And when you think prison, don't think of the TV show Porridge. Think about a rat-infested, stinking, rotten, smelly, dark dungeon. Again, in prison, Joseph soon found himself rising through the ranks of influence. Nothing could stop that character and that gifting from shining through. Eventually, he ran the prison essentially for the warden, which suggests to me that he was in there for quite some time working towards that position. Now, 2 of the people assigned to him, if you recall, were Pharaoh's baker and Pharaoh's butler, who for various mean reasons had offended their celestial master, found themselves in prison. Both of them had dreams which Joseph interpreted for them, as we recall, with mixed results for the subjects. Then 2 years later, eventually Joseph was remembered there in that prison And he was summoned to interpret a dream that Pharaoh had had that was really deeply disturbing and upsetting him. That dream turned out to be about 7 years of plenty in the land, which would be followed by 7 years of drought and famine. As a result of that, Joseph was finally released from prison. Actually, he was promoted into high office. He was about 30 years old by this time. And he was placed in charge of running a 14-year food storage and feeding program in the land. Genesis 41 verse 41, Pharaoh said to Joseph, I hereby put you in charge of the entire land of Egypt. Then Pharaoh removed his signet ring from his hand and placed it on Joseph's finger. Incredible symbol of authority. He dressed him in fine linen clothing and hung a gold chain around his neck. Then he had Joseph ride in the chariot reserved for his second in command. And wherever Joseph went, the command was shouted, kneel down. I love the contrast here between that brash, loud mouth, 17-year-old kid trumpeting his dreams and winding up his brothers and his parents to the point of desperation with this man. Genesis 41 verse 38, can we find anyone like this man, one in whom is the Spirit of God? Since God has made all this known to you, there is no one so discerning and wise as you. You shall be in charge of my palace, and all my people are to submit to your orders. Only with respect to the throne will I be greater than you. So here we have Joseph described as being full of the Spirit, as being discerning and wise, promoted to a position of great power and authority. That was quite the transformation. So that's the story. What can we learn from Joseph about faith? He was clearly a man who walked by faith. He was undoubtedly a man who learnt a lot about the workings of faith through his many ups and downs. What can we learn? So as an overview, as a summary, faith is a process. First of all, faith hopes. Faith starts with a glimpse. It starts with a dream. It starts with a word or a promise from God. For Noah, that was the instructions of how to build that ark. For Abraham, it was that incredible blessing. He would be the father of many nations. And for Joseph, it was those two powerful, poignant dreams. So first of all, faith hopes. Then secondly, faith walks. Faith trusts wholeheartedly. It waits patiently. It fights ferociously. And it endures as long as it takes. So first faith hopes, then faith walks, and then thirdly, one day, faith receives that God-given breakthrough or deliverance or favor moment. What fascinates me is the amazing way that Joseph stuck at it, the way he clung to his dreams, the way he learnt in time to walk in faith and integrity, and how he finished well, finally standing in the fullness of his promise. Arguably, starting is the easy bit. The passion, the excitement of that dream or that call or that promise. But often there's a considerable time lag between dream and fulfillment, between seed and harvest, between prayer and answer. And Joseph had a long journey from dream to fulfillment. And you know what? It was a bumpy road. It was full of setbacks and hard life lessons and character development. You know what? You and I will have to walk that road too. So let's take a little look here at how that faith process played out in Joseph's life. The first step, as we said, is that faith starts with hope. You know, God is in the business of planting dreams and desires in human hearts, both for your personal fulfillment and for his kingdom purposes. Psalm 37 verse 4, delight yourself in the Lord and he will give you the desires of your heart. Proverbs 13 verse 12, hope deferred makes the heart sick, but a dream fulfilled is a tree of life. It starts with a dream, with that godly desire, with that holy discontent, with that seed of possibility. You know, hope is a pivotal part of faith because that's where it all starts. You're probably familiar with Hebrews 11 verse 1, which says, now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So under this umbrella that faith starts with hope, just 4 points I'm going to make for you. The first one is this: faith starts with a seed of hope, something as yet unseen. And faith is the substance that brings that hope to fulfillment, so that what is at first unseen in time becomes seen reality. And faith is the tangible evidence that we're clinging on to that hope. The second point is that the Greek word for hope is the word elpis, and that literally means confident expectation, as opposed to a more whimsical, wishful thinking. And the primary difference there is where that hope comes from. You see, if our hope comes from God, that will lead to a confidence. And we can realistically have an expectation, as opposed to some unfounded wishful thinking, a pipe dream, a happy thought, or worldly optimism. You know, for sure, Joseph had elpis. He had confident expectation. He had that God-given, that Spirit-inspired dream. And that dream arrested him powerfully. That dream became the foundation of his faith journey. And eventually he saw it come to pass dramatically. Now, of course, the teenage Joseph didn't share that news with great tact or wisdom. And in fact, it stirred all kinds of jealousy. And it resulted in him being thrown into a well and sold into captivity. We could say it like this: that dream had a sizable hiccup. That leads to my third point, which is this: without hope, without elpis, without that confident expectation, the hiccups win. But true hope will pass the test of time, and it will be tested. Genesis 42, verses 8 and 9. Although Joseph recognized his brothers, they didn't recognize him. And he remembered the dreams he'd had about them many years before. Where would Joseph have ended up without those dreams? I wonder if he played them over and over in the bottom of that well, or in Pharaoh's dungeon, or as he replayed his brother's rejection and betrayal. You know, like you, Joseph's hope was severely tested. You see, without foundation, wishful thinking sinks. If it's sand rather than rock, the house gets easily blown over. Without elpis, without that confident expectation, dreams get sidetracked and derailed. We get distracted and discouraged and defeated. Hope is pivotal to the walk of faith. And hope is what you cling to when it becomes a fight, which it will. Hope is the breath of God that inspires and sustains you. I wonder, right now, at this moment in time, what is your hope fixed on? In what direction is it looking? Where did it come from? What is informing your hope? What is feeding your hope? What is steering your hope? You see, the danger is that we allow bad news to dominate our thinking, making our dream look distant, even impossible. The danger is that a sense of hopelessness which the enemy feeds constantly suffocates and strangles our hope, our dreams. The danger is we allow fear to cloud our view so that we can no longer even see hope. The danger is that we build our expectations on wishful thinking alone. And we end up chasing false hopes and dreams. The danger is that hope is really merely a selfish desire for pleasure and preservation rather than the plan of God for your lives. You know, true hope will pass the test of time, which is why it must be elpis. It must be God-given and word-based and spirit-inspired, because then it will be confident expectation. And that is the type that you cling to. Hebrews 10:23 says, "Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful." You know, Joseph made it through. Because though the circumstances repeatedly conspired against him, he held unswervingly to his hope and never lost sight of those two dreams. My fourth point under this title is more of a question, really. And the question is, can you see it? Can you see it? Here's a key line you've probably heard me say before. When walking by faith, it's not what you can see that counts. It's what you can see. In other words, with your natural eyes, we can only see the circumstances right under our nose, or the mountains looming right in front of us, or the shadows cast by our past experiences behind us. But our faith eyes see a different picture. And that picture is the word of God, and it's the promises of God, and it's the purposes of God. The eye of faith is able to see the picture of hope that God has revealed to your heart. Hebrews 11 verse 1 again. Now faith is being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. And I think the key is that Joseph, he saw something. It started in that dream. In that dream, he had a glimpse of his destiny, and it lingered deep in his spirit. And to him, what he saw was clear, and it was real, and it was focal. And so that was the picture he kept on staring at through it all. With his natural eyes, he saw rejection, and he saw slavery, and he saw injustice and imprisonment. But he refused to see that because Hebrews 11 verse 1, he was sure of what he hoped for and certain of what he did not see. So for you right now, what can you see? What can you see? It may be that the current circumstances you find yourself in have clouded your view or distracted you from your dream or ambushed your hope. Perhaps today you need to go back to that dream seed. What has God called you to? What has God shown you? What is the journey that you're on? What is the target that you're aiming for? Because do you know what? If you can see it with your faith eyes, then you can cling on to it. And that leads us nicely, I think, into the second part of our faith process, which is that faith walks. So the first part, faith hopes. The second part is that faith then has to walk. We know, don't we, that the walk of faith is a marathon and not a sprint. It's taken one step at a time. Our faith must trust wholeheartedly. It must wait patiently. It must fight ferociously. And it must endure as long as it takes. I have a couple of quotes for you from one of my favourite speakers and authors, Mark Batson. The first one goes like this. He says, "Dream big, pray hard, and think long." The second quote is, "The key to dreaming big is thinking long. And the bigger the dream, the longer the timeline. When you think in terms of eternity, you should have some dreams that can't be accomplished in your lifetime." If you're dreaming big, be prepared to think long, to pray hard, and I'll add, to fight for it. Paul told us, didn't he, that we'd have to fight the good fight of faith. It's a fight because any God-given dream is inevitably going to be challenged. If there wasn't going to be any challenge, by definition, you wouldn't need faith. I'm reminded of the book Pilgrim's Progress, in that the character Christian comes up against such places as the slough of despond. It's a swamp. Comes up against hill difficulty, the valley of the shadow of death, doubting castle. Those are the places that he came up against, and do you know what? You will too. Joseph certainly did. The reality is, if you want to turn your hope into reality, your dream into fulfillment, you're going to have to fight for it. You're going to have to trust wholeheartedly and wait patiently, fight ferociously, and endure as long as it takes. Why? Because just like Joseph, you are going to face setbacks, and you are going to face obstacles and temptations on the way. As I pondered that, I came up with a quick list of some of the challenges we face between dream and fulfillment. Just 5 on my list. The first one is the temptation to lose hope through frustration. The second is the temptation to doubt God through unbelief. The third one is the temptation to get poisoned by bitterness through offense. Number 4 is the temptation to try and fix it ourselves through impatience. And number 5 is the temptation to get there quicker through compromise. The enemy attacks Joseph in each of those areas, and he'll go after you there too. The flip to that is that through all those perceived setbacks and obstacles and failures, God is at work for his purposes. Now, here's what I think you come to realize in time. It would appear that to the Lord, the lessons learnt on the way are more important than the final result or destination. It's the character that is refined in our lives. It's the wisdom that we develop. It's the values that we cultivate that are more significant in God's eyes than the final outcome or destination. Perhaps that's why he permits those apparent demonic assignments against you. Let's look at that list of 5 challenges. Now, I'm just going to pull out one actually that was particularly relevant, particularly potent in Joseph's story, his experience. And that's the third one on my list. And that was the temptation to get poisoned by bitterness through offense. You know, I've seen so many allow offense to get in the way, sabotage their dream. I marvel, don't you, at how Joseph was able to forgive his brothers 13 years later. He could have spent those 13 years replaying the betrayal, criticizing his brother's decisions, assassinating their character. He could have spent it grumbling at his lot. He could have blamed his brothers for each new crisis along the line. He could have sunk deeper into self-pity. You know, out of that festering anger could have grown a deep resentment, allowing a root of bitterness to form and poison his heart. You know, if that had been the case, I wonder how Genesis chapters 42 through 45 would have played out. I wonder what might have happened to the Hebrew family, to that entire race, if offense had won. But you know what? Joseph didn't allow his mind to go there. I suspect it was really hard. I imagine he had some bad days. But you know what? Joseph kept a vice-like grip on that dream. I saw their sheaves bowing down before mine. I saw the sun and the moon and 11 stars bowing down low before me. I have a calling. I have a destiny. I have a responsibility. Do it, Lord. Do it in your power. Do it your way. Do it for your glory. God, I'm trusting in you. I'm fixing my eyes on you. I'm not going to let that offense in. I'm just not going to let it in. Lord, would you help me guard my mind? Would you help me keep my heart pure? Because one day we're all going to need to drink the water out of that well. Let's read that part of the story, shall we? It's so good. Remember, the brothers have now come to Egypt. They're deep in that 7-year famine period, and they are frankly desperate for food. We remember, don't we, that Joseph played this little game with his brothers in order to get all 11 of them in the same place at the same time. And then here comes the great reveal. Genesis 45 verse 3. I am Joseph, he said to his brothers. Is my father still alive? But his brothers were speechless. They were stunned to realize that Joseph was standing there in front of them. Please come closer, he said to them. So they came closer. And he said again, I am Joseph, your brother, whom you sold into slavery in Egypt. But don't be upset. And don't be angry with yourselves for selling me to this place. It was God who sent me here ahead of you to preserve your lives. This famine that has ravaged the land for 2 years will last 5 more years, and there will be neither ploughing nor harvesting. God has sent me ahead of you to keep you and your families alive and to preserve many survivors. So it was God who sent me here, not you. And he is the one who made me an advisor to Pharaoh, the manager of his entire palace and the governor of all Egypt. You know, for me, the defining factor, although I'm sure he had many dark days between the age of 17 and 30. You know, in time, when it matters, Joseph was able to see the purposes of God clearly. He was able to see how God had been at work in spite of those incredibly difficult situations he found himself in. He was able to see how God was working in him the character that he would need to fulfill that lofty and weighty destiny, a character that was sadly lacking when he was 17. In time, he could see how skillfully God had maneuvered him into just the position he needed to be to save his family at the crucial moment. And he was able to see the bigger picture. He was able to see the spiritual warfare dimension. Genesis 50, verse 20, famous verse. "You intended to harm me," he said to his brothers. I think he was really speaking to someone else. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it all for good. He brought me to this position so I could save the lives of many people." You know, I very much doubt that the 17-year-old Joseph had it mapped out like that in his head. And I very much doubt that the 17-year-old you would have mapped it out like this either. But you know what? Aren't you glad that God is on the throne? You know, God will show you a glimpse. You know, your gifts and your passions are a hint. God will give you dreams to hang your hope on. But ultimately, you have to trust God. Ultimately, you have to walk by faith. You have to be prepared to fight through the inevitable distraction and opposition and setbacks. You have to recognize that God may be using those very things to maneuver you right to where you need to be. You need to be able to trust that God is able to bring about the fulfillment of his purposes supernaturally, probably surprisingly, when the time is just right. So number one, faith hopes. Number two, faith walks, faith fights. And number three, the final part of this process is that faith receives. Even the word receive implies a divine source. Faith receives from a God who gives. But faith does have to stretch out its hand. Faith does have to cling to its hopes and dreams. Faith does have to walk the walk and fight the fight. Hebrews 10, verse 23 says, "Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful." Dropping down to verse 35, "So do not throw away your confidence, it will be richly rewarded." You need to persevere so that when you've done the will of God, you receive what he has promised. "For in just a very little while, he who is coming will come and will not delay. But my righteous one will live by faith. And if he shrinks back, I will not be pleased with him." Verse 39, "But we are not of those who shrink back and are destroyed, but of those who believe and are saved." I'm going to leave you with just two challenges today. The first one is this: are your hopes and dreams alive and well, or dead and buried? You know, maybe as you've been listening to this message today, maybe God has been stirring afresh in your heart right now. Maybe that dream has been dead. Maybe it's been distant. Maybe it's been dormant. But maybe today God is just stirring again. You know, just as Joseph had those dreams to hang on, maybe there's a dream in the back of your mind. Maybe God is stirring that pot again and bringing it back to the surface. Let me ask you another question. What can you see? What can you see? I'm thinking about your hopes and your dreams. What can you see? Let me ask, is your view right now, in this moment in time, in this stage, this season of your life, is that view being dominated by your natural eyes or your faith eyes? You know, as we learned from Joseph's story, our natural eyes are always going to be throwing all sorts of things in our way, in our view. The question is, what can you see with your faith eyes? I'd encourage you today to take that to the Lord and say, Lord, what can I see? What do I need to see? What do you want me to see? Lord, would you sharpen and brighten that hope and that dream and that vision that I have for your ends and your purposes. So number one is are your hopes and dreams alive and well or dead and buried? And the second one is, are you still fighting or have you given up? I'll put it like this. Have you allowed certain things in to come and to sabotage that dream? You know, perhaps like Joseph, there was a demonic assignment against assignments against that dream. Perhaps you allowed offense or disappointment or some form of crisis of confidence to sneak in. One day you woke up and it seemed as though that hope was gone. If that's the case, I'd encourage you today to remember Joseph. Remember his journey. And I'd encourage you to guard that heart. And I'd encourage you today to do business with God. And I'd encourage you to get back in the fight. Number one, are your hopes and dreams alive and well or dead and buried? And what is God saying to you about that? And number two, are you still in the fight or have you given up? And you know what? If you've fallen over, today might be a great day to get back up. I'm going to pray and then we'll be done. God, I want to thank you so much for the richness of the story, for the example of Joseph. Thank you, Lord, that you used him remarkably, miraculously to save a whole nation. Father, thank you for the journey that he had to go on that teaches us so much. Lord, every one of us are on a journey. We all have hopes and dreams at various stages of fulfillment. Right now, in this current time, it may seem as though those are under assault from all sides. So, Father, today we present you with our hopes and dreams. Lord, would you recrystallize them? Would you re-energize them? Would you re-spark those hopes and those dreams in our hearts and minds? Lord, would you help us to have the strength to take the next step, to fight that good fight of faith? And if there's anything that's come in the way, if that dream has been sabotaged, if offense has come in, if we've fallen into any of those temptations, Lord, we ask for your forgiveness. We receive your grace and say, Lord, would you pick us back up out of that miry pit of clay, put our feet back on the rock. And Lord, maybe we go striding back on, boldly, determinedly, full of faith, in pursuit of the dreams and purposes, the plans that you have for our lives. And God, we worship you. We thank you that you are on the throne of our lives. We thank you that you are a God who is faithful. You are the God of the promise. You are the God who gives us dreams, desires, and hopes. And Lord, we worship you. We honor you. We keep our eyes fixed on you through it all. In Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.